The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
We're back with a new episode of The Goldwaters, and I'm here with Anne-France. I'm your moderator, Dan Delmar, by the way. And Anne-France, we're tackling a very tough subject today, the Me Too movement, which we were talking earlier this week, seems like a bit of a catharsis for issues that you know have been present and around for a long time, and issues that you've dealt with in your practice for a very long time.
Well, not just in my practice, but more in my private life. And it's certainly difficult to engage in a conversation with my children about how a previous generation, my own, dealt with the notion of sexual harassment and sexual assault, and how mores were different, and what behaviors were tolerated, and what type of sexual assault in dating relationships was just sort of par for the course. The most delicate part that I don't even know how to broach with them, of course, is the very fact of the relationship I had with their father, right? Who was a high school teacher and much older than I, and I'm much younger than he. And in today's world, if that would be brought out, he'd go to jail. And it's kind of strange to see society trying to tackle with events that happened 20, 30, and 40 years ago, if not more, that were viewed and experienced differently at that time, and try to judge them with today's moral lens. I don't know that it's really possible. I don't know that it's really fair. I have to say, having experienced, like I'm sure many women, I have no doubt, in fact, that this has to be the common experience of many women. I don't think my life was particularly different from that of other women at that age. We all go through a number of years where we're young and attractive and palatable and out there in the open market, and are therefore viewed by many men as prey, where the men are predatory and the women are the prey. And I'm stunned, in fact, when you hear the testimonies and the stories related by women of experiences they had many years ago, and they are marked by them today. These are women who are clearly hugely traumatized. Even now, there was the testimony of this woman who's got to be about my age, who was the prey of Roy Moore and who was sexually assaulted by him when she was 14 years of age. When I listened to her tell the story, I was looking at the face of a woman my age, an aging face, but the voice that was speaking was the voice of a 14-year-old. There was not a shadow of a doubt in my mind that her story was true and sincere, and the trauma that she had suffered as a result of the story was absolutely true, because the voice changed. Her voice was different, her demeanor, her affect. It was, and I was deeply upset and deeply troubled, because I have a different character, I have a different personality, and I always viewed these events as being, hello, this is the pitfall of being a woman. And I recognize many men don't understand these pitfalls. It was, in fact, only in the last 6 months or so that my husband, who's about my age and who's never assaulted a woman in his life, it would never occur to him to assault a woman in his life, realized suddenly that when he goes out walking on the mountain at night with our dogs, while I might be staying up late preparing for a trial, and he notices that there's only other men walking out late at night, either alone or with their dogs. And it suddenly occurred to him there are no women alone. And he realized, well, because even if you're walking with your dog, you're not safe. And I looked at him and I blinked, and I was stunned, because it would never occur to me there's a chasm between the man I've lived with for so many years, a chasm of understanding. And he literally hadn't realized until that moment, well, duh, even in a hugely safe city like Montreal, in a culture that does not believe in the assault of women, we're not in any primitive type of culture here. We're pretty modern, if not ironically postmodern. And yet, even a woman my age would not go out alone at night, even with her dog, because it's not safe. And so I think that there is a failure of the two sexes to communicate with each other and that we women seem to fail to make you men understand that we may not be afraid of you or your brother, your neighbor, or your cousin, or your best friend, but we don't know who to be afraid of because in general, we're at risk.
You've been fighting feminist battles for a while. We're calling it the Me Too movement, but this general movement of denouncing sexual aggressors, is this among the more productive, cathartic exercises that you've seen in the past few decades in terms of advancing feminism?
I thought the previous one was Been Raped, Never Reported, the one started by Sue Montgomery. I thought that was very cathartic. I was tempted to participate because I can, and decided that I don't like being thrust in the role of being a victim. I don't like participating in a movement that would emphasize again that brutal reality that women can be victims of male aggression, right? So as cathartic as this is, it's still very hard to defeat a certain men's rights movement that's quite prevalent in some sectors of society that I've run up against, notably in Quebec, that try to pretend that the minute women talk about male aggression, that it's causing harm to men, and it's an aggression against men. And these kinds of men become all the more aggressive against women. These women are engaged in male bashing. They're very aggressive about it. It's quite odd. You would think people would see through that. So it's kind of paradoxical that we have the Me Too movement in the age of Trump. And I'm not sure how society is reconciling those two because nobody has impeached the biggest sexual abuser of all.
Let's get to the conversation. Male aggression and the Me Too movement on the Goldwaters. Goldwaters, right now in North American society, we're dealing with a scandal, really, in media. Powerful men having violated the women around them. We're seeing this outpouring of stories and of support for women who are victims of sexual harassment and assault. On this program, we're going to talk about the Me Too movement and where it's all headed. So I'll start with Anne-France to kick off the conversation today. And we've had this conversation in numerous forums, Anne-France, over the years. And the question here that we'll start with is there something in our brains, in the brain of a man, that is sexually aggressive and that needs to be suppressed?
That question is so loaded. I have to say, what bothers me, again, in my life as a middle-aged woman, 57 years of age, is always feeling at a certain point deeply alienated by trends in popular thought. So it's as if there's this sudden societal discovery about the sexual aggressiveness of men, and in particular powerful men. I am a little stymied that society would wake up to the notion that men not only can be sexually aggressive, but aspire to be sexually aggressive. And the more other parts of their person permit them to be that way, such as the acquisition of power or social status or wealth, the more they are free or consider themselves free to indulge in that sexual aggression. I'm not exactly sure there's a woman who exists on the earth who has not been subject to what we call in contemporary society sexual harassment. And it leaves me a little bewildered because I don't understand why that's the name for something that I consider intrinsic to the way a great number of men behave, to the extent that there are also a great number of men who behave in a more reserved way to have what they want or to get what they want, reflects the fact that some of us women are better at perhaps conditioning some of the men. But I do deeply believe that it is very much the raw nature of man to be sexually aggressive. And I have a lot of discomfort with some of the things that are happening today that are ruining lives.
But sexual harassment, I didn't admittedly do research on its origins in terms of the actual expression, but I mean, it is sort of was once a problem without a name, right? I mean, that I know the Anita Hill scandal really brought this to the forefront in the beginning of the 90s, and then after in the 90s you had a flood of sexual harassment allegations in the workplace that were brought through sometimes escalated to civil courts, and so when you say that this has always been the case, and you're stymied by the fact that you see that people are now just discovering it, I think that maybe because prior it was just something that was just more normalized. I mean, it's something that I've noticed in this cultural moment with the Weinstein scandal and its fallout and all these other men who are being accused. I notice a generational component, and I don't have a lot of data.
For sure.
I don't have data to back this up. It's more of a gut feeling, so excuse me. But I do find that a lot of the behavior, I find it hard to imagine men under 40 engage in this type of behavior. Now, it's not to say that younger men don't engage in sexual misconduct. Of course they do. But it's a different maybe kind, right? I mean, the notion of slapping your secretary on the butt is something kind of a Mad Men era type of thing. And some of the things that I'm hearing about some of these men, like groping their, their subordinates of the opposite sex at the workplace, I just have trouble grokking. Maybe, I mean, you might be able to comment more to
I
that.
absolutely believe it's generational. There's not a question, not a shot of a doubt. There are behaviors that used to be socially tolerated prior to my generation when I was a child and observed how older men behaved. And then as I grew up, and there were some changes then. You know, the joke about the boss who would chase his secretary around the desk, or who would give her a lot of pencils to sharpen in the pencil sharpener, because that would make she'd bend over and her derriere would wriggle. And the idea that a boss could touch a subordinate's body, or a secretary's body, all things I find absolutely gross, mortifying, and to me beyond the pale, and we're beyond the pale even then. One of the things I didn't understand, I started maybe by saying I feel a little odd at 57 observing this, what might be a societal change, is, the reverse is also true. When I was very young, when I was a teenager and a young woman, and more likely to be the object of those attentions or contacts or so on, I found it so beyond my ken and my understanding that a man would think that he could touch any portion of a woman's anatomy, including her elbow, to guide her through a doorway. There would be paternalistic touchings that I always felt men never understood consent. Maybe that's the one thing that hasn't changed in my perception. Society may have changed, but I've also never understood why a man would believe it is ever appropriate to touch a woman's body without consent, and that's any part of her body.
And I think you're touching on something really important. Like when we get to are men intrinsically bad or something, I don't think so any more than women are intrinsically bad. I think we all have impulses in us that can be deeply problematic. I think that one thing that's, that we're paying more attention to now, not that this is a new phenomenon by any stretch of the imagination, but that's where the lens has been, the spotlight's been put on now, is in terms of men not respecting consent, or not seeking out consent to touch women's bodies or expose themselves sexually to women, or do anything else. And I think the impression that I get is that a lot of men, if we're talking about the under 40 crowd, let's say, and let's go with the over 40 as well, why not, is that they really don't understand consent. If I think of our generation, Daniel, I think that, we were really raised on no means no. That was really the dialogue when we were growing up.
Right.
And so and I feel that was kind of a shift over our generation, that it became like, okay, well, if you go on a date with a woman, or if you're walking down the street and you pursue her and you try to touch her and she forcefully and aggressively says no, then you are a rapist and a bad man if you continue. But the conversation with respect to consent didn't really go much past that. There was some hubbub a few years ago as people were talking about affirmative consent in universities, as as the spotlight shifted to women that were being sexually assaulted on university campuses, and most people kind of laughed it off, like, what, I'm supposed to ask each step of the way? Oh, can I kiss a woman? Yes. Can I kiss your neck? Can I kiss your breast, or whatever? How ridiculous is that? Doesn't that take away the romance and the passion and the enthusiasm of the whole thing? And women would even say the same thing. And what I'm hoping with these recent allegations and accusations that are being put forward to light of these powerful men who have been sexually assaulting and harassing women is that it's not just no means no. The conversation needs to evolve past that. That a lot of women, because they may be in subordinate positions, or because they're afraid, or because they've been conditioned that way, And frankly, a lot of men in lower power positions, as you'll see with Kevin Spacey, for example, or the people that have accused him, is that they don't feel like they have the power to say no and to forcefully say no, or that it's going to be listened to or respected. And so they may just sort of smile, they may giggle, they may brush it off, they may freeze. One of the emergency responses isn't just fight and flight, it's also freeze. And so I think that's where the conversation needs to shift to.
I think the conversation already got there in Canada, certainly with our Supreme Court, that only yes means yes. But now you're talking about in situations that are already intimate. This phenomenon, this latest phenomenon with the hashtag #MeToo, is more... I don't even know how much it is really about sex, because, it's very interesting. I guess I started it by addressing the notion of consent, that I find men have a problem with consent, understanding it, and that seems to be pervasive. And you ran with that ball, Samantha.
Well, and again, not, hashtag not all men and everything else. But
let me just speak up for men, because every time you say that, I do find it a little irksome. I mean, you don't think that... What data are you relying on? Just your life experience? Think that all men, most men, do understand consent? I really think that's a broad accusation.
I think
I'm not saying it as an accusation. I'm just saying I'm just saying that my thread of thinking, how I have evolved with respect to society's reactions, I was just commenting on the one thing that's constant in my mind, which is that at each stage in life, in a different societal perspective, I've always been stricken by the number of men who have a difficulty understanding consent. Because as I say, there are many men who have very polite behaviors. Remember, it's where I had got to in
the paternalistic
the notion,
guiding.
the paternalistic guiding a woman by taking her elbow, or I'm not saying it always has a sexual component, and nor am I trying to pillory all men. But I'm just saying I found it odd my entire life that this confusion seems to exist. And needless to say, I've always found the most charming men to be the men who understand to wait for the invitation. A man who understands to wait for the invitation will attract any woman. The man who forces the attention is going to attract revulsion. But my opinion.
I know, and then that's a fine opinion. But I'm curious. Then, what do you think? Since I'll speak to both you and Samantha, you're the women in the room.
We are.
Last, from what I understand. The Supreme Court doctrine right now that you referred to earlier, which is active, ongoing consent, right? And Samantha,
consent to every step. There must be positive consent.
And Samantha, you described it as, can I kiss you on the lips? Can I kiss you on the neck? Can I kiss you on the breast? Right? On ongoing active consent. I mean, I think that there are a lot. What do you guys think of that?
Well, that's why in the recent case, which we all know affectionately as the case of the godemiché being the lovely French word for dildo, that was the case where the unmarried but cohabiting couple, because it's a case that started in Quebec and nobody here marries anymore, so everybody refers to them as husband and wife when they were not husband and wife, but they were a couple with children. And they engaged in erotic asphyxiation. And while engaging in erotic asphyxiation, and the wife, the person playing the role of the wife, was unconscious, the person calling himself the husband penetrated her with the dildo anally. And then she laid criminal charges against him for the august purpose of influencing the decision on custody, because they separated shortly thereafter. And, and again, that raises the specter of abuse of what assault is, and it harkens even back to the days of Woody Allen and Mia Farrow's conduct with a view to frustrating Woody Allen having any part of the custody of their children, their troop of children. So there's always this specter of abuse by women that doesn't get enough attention in the public. So that being said, even though by the time it went to the Supreme Court, the judges noted that the purpose of the wife at the time was malicious in laying the charges, and that she wanted to withdraw the charge. That was part of what created the debate in the first place. The Supreme Court insisted on maintaining the conviction for sexual assault on the husband based on the doctrine that if she was unconscious, she could not give positive consent. And you cannot give consent in advance. You must give consent on the moment.
if we can go kind of a little bit back here, we're starting to slip into kind of legal arguments of what the law should be. And I think that, if we put it a little bit back, I think that where the exact line is, and if there's going to be, I think it's going to be difficult to have a stark line for some of the really sort of grayer issues about what constitutes, let's say, harassment and just something that's, not great judgment or just a little bit icky. And I think that the general standard, not necessarily, I don't think it should necessarily, we'll see how it goes legally, but just societal standard is that you want the person, whatever you're doing that involves somebody else, a conversation, a cup of tea, a meal, sex, that the other person that you're engaging with should be down with it also.
Now, back to the science of the male brain. A recent study showed that powerful men who have elevated levels of testosterone often make bad decisions, especially in the markets, for example. Do you think this could apply to some of the harassment allegations we're seeing? Do you think perhaps there's an argument or a suggestion, according to recent studies, that high testosterone men may be more susceptible of various abuses in the workplace?
No, hang on a second. If you do that, you're going to create an excuse, because then men are going to come say, it's not my fault, I suffer from a biological disorder because I have elevated testosterone levels. There's something called being a human being, and being a human being means that men have a certain level of testosterone. And yes, of course, that's what makes them sexually aggressive. That's why 7-year-old boys are not sexually aggressive in the way that 17-year-olds are. And that's why as men get past a certain age, these behaviors start to calm down. But that doesn't make the behavior itself or the desire itself or the sexual aggressiveness itself a disorder. It's not a disorder. I think human beings are filled with aggression, some of it sexual, some not. And I think that part of the advance in civilization is as we've developed abilities to tone down our aggressiveness, our natural aggression with each other. And now we're even working on toning down our aggression with respect to our environment and our fellow mammals. So it's a small piece of a bigger picture. So let's not pathologize men's sex drive and call it something disordered. That's not fair to men. It's not fair to mankind, not even fair to women. To say that high testosterone levels create bad trading decisions even makes me laugh, because women who, because of their estrogen, are more risk averse, are likely to trade their investment accounts a lot less aggressively. They make fewer mistakes and therefore have better returns. Now, the question is, which is better? From one perspective, the fact that men are willing to engage in risk-taking behaviors that are mediated by their different hormonal makeup is part of what advances civilization. Women have to have a different type of hormonal balance because, for the most part, they assume a different role. Now, fortunately, none of this is that black and white. And as we live with each other and socialize each other, we have more and more women who are willing to engage in risk-taking behaviors, which miraculously they are able to do without indulging in testosterone shots. And you have more and more men who are taking nurturing and caretaking roles and are learning to curb a natural social aggression so that they can fulfill their roles in society, even as CEOs, without bringing the aggression into the role that may also ruin it. So I think the simple truth is that and what made us perhaps different from other animals who have a different level of cognition and sentience than we, is we've stopped being the prisoners of our hormonal levels, our biological levels, long ago in our evolution. And it would be really ridiculous in today's world to pretend for a minute that women are incapable of the risk-taking business behaviors that men engage in, even though we're more inclined, the statistics say, to work collaboratively. And it would be just as ridiculous to say that men today are uniformly aggressive risk takers and abusive of their employees.
A lot of times when we look at the science, particularly when we're looking at gender differences or differences between other groups, we're focusing on gender differences now. We like to, as soon as we find statistically significant differences in whatever variable, we say, okay, so men are like this and women are like this, and we make it seem like they're two separate populations that are super starkly different and never the two shall meet. But the thing is, often when you start digging into the data, you see that the differences are often rather small. and account for very, very, very small effect sizes and are often only visible when you're looking in big enough populations. Then you'll start to see, on average, men may be slightly more likely to do XYZ with high testosterone, and on average, women with high estrogen, let's say, may be slightly more likely to do, ABC. But the differences aren't that big. There's a lot of overlap between the genders. And even as we're talking, and even as what you're bringing up, Daniel, what you're bringing up, Mom, is that there's a ton of other mitigating factors. That these differences aren't, it doesn't mean that they're fatal and that they're stark. It can mean that there's a bunch of other things, other factors, other cognitions, other people, other societal influences that can mitigate those differences or can exacerbate them. And I think one thing when we're talking about sexual assault and sexual harassment that's really exacerbated some of the differences between the genders here is power. And that, in most societies now and still, and then historically, men have been in positions of power.
Okay,
And continue
but
to
you
be.
also
Yes.
don't want to overstate that factor either. I am siding though with Samantha for more nuance in this. Even when you talk about testosterone levels, let's not forget that's not a fixed T level in a man's life. And within a day, my testosterone and your testosterone varies, right? It varies based on your exercise, what you ate, what you're feeling in a moment. I think there's a lot of it's overstated the effect of testosterone in general for the reasons Samantha said, but I'm also adding this other mix to it that it
That's
changes.
variable within the person, not even just between
That's
people.
right. And I think what's more important are the system or the context the person finds himself in, and what are the incentives and disincentives of that system.
Yes, and I think that that's where power can really come into play, because I think that depending on your power, it can act on in society or in a given situation or environment, that it could act as an accelerator or an inhibitor to whatever proclivities
But that would
may
be
be there.
belied by the fact that low status men who are not in corporate boardrooms or might be engaged in all sorts of sexual violence. I mean,
They may, but oftentimes, not necessarily, but oftentimes they're looking for women or for men or for other partners that they believe to be in lower, that they believe to be, let's say, not let's go as low status, easier targets.
yeah, but that's just a strategic decision, Samantha. I'd
Sure,
be silly
sure.
if you're like
But if you have,
down
but
on
let's
your
just
luck.
say it's a strategic decision. Sure, let's say it's a conscious strategic decision. If you're in a position where you have two people where, for all things being equal, they both have similar drives and similar impulses, and one person has more opportunity to have those strategic decisions, has more people that are potentially below them or potentially easy to take advantage of, and the other one doesn't, then that creates a different situation.
Now, on the media rhetoric, it's been a very touchy movement, and some men are expressing some discomfort about the Me Too movement. It's catching a whole lot of different offenses into one basket, anything from comments all the way up to actual sexual assault. Is there a risk here that this movement goes too far?
I think one of the things that there's always that risk. Anytime you have any sort of social movement that's beginning, then you're adding a lot of momentum. You're pushing the pendulum in a different direction, and oftentimes it's going to swing pretty far before it starts to swing back a little bit and correct. My hope with this is that this is going to be a sustained enough movement that it's not going to swing hard back in the other direction, that it's going to we're going to find a new equilibrium, a new balance that's going to be a little bit healthier. I think that, my feelings are that it can be a bit problematic to be lumping in sexual harassment along with sexual assault, and that sometimes there's only so much outrage that we can have, and we get a little bit exhausted, and it can be hard to be as we're consuming these stories, these sexual assault and sexual harassment stories, and just icky conduct stories. Then sometimes we can get a little fatigued after it. We run out of outrage, and then we move on to the next thing. And I think that could be a big problem and can really get in the way of the movement. That said, do I have a great solution for it? Not necessarily, because I think it still is also important to bring to light some of the more, some sexual harassment, some of the more nuanced interactions going on, so that we can foster dialogue and come up with a new balance and a new equilibrium. What I hope with this movement, and it's been so far sustained while-ish now for internet, for Twitter movements, is that there's going to be a lot more concrete actions that are going to be taken. It's interesting to see all these men that have lost their positions of power because of these accusations that have been put forward. And I hope that that while the movement is going, that people capitalize to actually change, let's say, laws or change regulations or change policies in companies.
I'm not worried about policies and companies. I'm worried about facts on the ground. And I'm very taken with your image of the pendulum. And I don't think it's a pendulum. So let's start with a very positive outcome. I happen to be morally convinced, being reasonably well acquainted with a number of men when acting at their most raw, that men are very motivated learners when it comes to being inculcated as what it is they need to do to please women and make women happy and have what they ultimately want, which is a pleasant, intimate reaction with a woman that is mutually gratifying. At the end of the day, I give men enough credit to know that that is what they really want, which is kind of sad when you see the number of men who misfire and aren't getting what they really want, which is a mutually satisfying intimate relationship.
I think a lot of men want that. I think some of the more egregious offenders, let's say a Harvey Weinstein or a Bill Cosby or something like that, may not be.
Right, they may not be. But we don't need to look at the outliers. We need to look at the great unwashed mass of men out there who find women mysterious creatures and really want to reach us in a very good way. So I would say that the great part of my life experience from generation to generation, because I'm old enough to experience a few generations, is a constant desire, but an increasing adeptness at being attuned to what women want. And not just what women want when they're horizontal, but what women want when they're vertical and before they get to horizontal. So I have to say I've been very satisfied. Then again, we're really spoiled, though, because we're growing up in Quebec and in Canada. And I have to say, as a general proposition, it is my subjective impression that not only are Canadian men, for the large part, way less aggressive than some of the American men I've seen, but in particular that Quebecois men are particularly loving. And I want to say it again to be clear. A man's deep desire in expressing his sexual desire, in my experience, has been wanting to find the right ways and the right words and the right moves to satisfy his partner, so she is as satisfied and thrilled as he is. So that's part of this culture, and it's a great thing. And that's why I don't think a pendulum's going to move back. I think that a lot of men are finding this instructive and are willing to learn. But the part that I do have a problem with is not just outrage, exhaustion, and not just conflating trivial social misdeeds and serious sexual assault. But in addition, I say again, very little of this has to do with sex and has to do a lot more with, in my opinion, a real class struggle.
Speaking as a man, I have found this whole scandal confusing, but I have to say, looking back on it so far, I think I have actually changed my feelings about it. In that my first reaction to a lot of these scandals is that I really don't identify with the argument that, oh, now, like you were alluding to earlier, Mom, that men are so confused today about what constitutes consent. There's this oversensitive culture, and that men really have a hard time understanding what consent is.
They always have.
Well, again, obviously, this is my own subjective opinion about myself, but I've been around. I'm my mother's son, and so I also have a penchant for kind of blue humor, and I can be provocative, and I have a big mouth. And I also, for most of my life, have worked in an office place with majority women, and I could say with confidence that I've never been any ambiguity about consent in my private life or in my professional life in terms of behavior, intimate behavior. Or with any sexual connotations. Like, it seems to me it's always rather clear and evident. Whenever I hear about these stories, my first reaction was, well, these guys are kind of clueless. Like, how does one misinterpret what a woman wants? When I heard about these HR sexual harassment training sessions that go on in bigger companies, which we've never had at our small business, I kind of laughed at first. I'm like, really? Like, people need to be trained on this? And I think maybe a lot of people kind of laugh it off. But I was thinking about it, especially reading, preparing for this podcast and reading more about it. Like when I've made some off-color jokes, I'll admit it, like in the presence of coworkers, female coworkers. And I asked myself, like, can that constitute sexual harassment? I didn't harass. It wasn't a comment about the person. And I think there can be perhaps ambiguities that I've just never run afoul of. Like I've never actually gotten.
And that's the one thing that I find encouraging with, one of the things I find encouraging about the Me Too movement is the number of men that have started to reevaluate and question their past behavior and say, was that really what I thought it was? Was she really into it? Was this really okay? Was this an all right situation? And I think that that's really important to just reevaluate. And whatever side you come out on, I think it's an important question and deliberation, not to take those things for granted.
The deliberation is important, but to throw some extra ambiguity on this, there
Yes.
is something always about tone and personality and context that I always find is really a case-by-case thing. I mean, there are incidences where, I've often said, for example, there's some people who can call me Jewish, and it's just an observation, just like, okay, it's like whatever, it's like the sky is blue. And some people can call me Jew or Jewish, and it's an offense. Like, I know that their intention is different, right? Or someone even gets to call me something like kike or some sort of really like a slur, but it's a friendly slur from a certain context. So if someone can say my name, and I'm like, you're saying this in an aggressive tone.
You mean like when I say Daniel?
To just add one thing there, I think a lot of times when we're talking about, the swing and the Me Too, we start talking about the grayer areas, the areas that seem a bit more innocuous, and saying, well, how far is this going to go? And then am I going to have to, I have to rethink how I say hello? Can I still shake somebody's hand, or is that going to be considered assault unless I seek affirmative consent before reaching my hand out? And I think sometimes that misses the point, and it's something that we need to just watch for in the Me Too movement, where there's been sort of this mix of all these different experiences of varying intensity kind of put together, is that we don't want to get lost in the conversation about the gray areas. There's a lot of areas that are pretty clear, and I think we need to really be able to focus on those and still take action on those and not use the gray areas or the milder areas, let's say, as an excuse to ignore the real issue that's going on, whether it be abuse of power or where there's abuse of power by men on women or in business situations, from authority figures to subordinates.
Also, not just with respect to that there are gray zones. I mean, there are zones that are clearly abusive, but then there are gradations of abuse. I mean, when you talk about Roy Moore, right, the Alabaman politician is now running for Senate, and he's being accused of having sexually assaulted minors, and there are many accusations against him. That's a far cry from, say, maybe Louis C.K., who is masturbating in front of women. They're both piggish behavior, bad behavior, and they both are abusive. But there is a difference, and I think that we can't lose sight of that. And the other thing I'll say about the outrage culture that I do find a little problematic is what I find fascinating is analyzing the responses of all these alleged assaulters or harassers. And you get these, and I find that many, many different sorts. I mean, maybe you can typify them. Maybe there's 3 or 4 that you can see that kind of come out. Some are total denials. Some are, lawyer, PR mitigated guy goes out and says something.
Some are attack the accuser.
Yeah, some are attack the accuser. Some are mea culpa. And I do find that I haven't seen one media outlet that has said that this is a sufficient apology or this is an appropriate apology. And the one that I have to say, I mentioned Louis C.K., I found his response to be one of the most satisfying responses to these allegations. He admitted it unequivocally.
There's no coinage in an apology. I don't agree with it. There's no coinage in an apology. I would have thought that an apology is a good thing because it's good for the soul, but not in these highly charged battles and skirmishes in these class wars.
I think that for a lot of these men, making a public apology might not be sufficient. I mean, it might be one response of many. Maybe you'd also have to have some form of restitution for the victim, some sort of compensatory action, maybe a donation to awareness campaigns or to groups also getting help. Like a lot of these people, all of these men have said that they're going to go through therapy, go to rehab. I mean, there are many notes that should be hit, but on the apology, isolated issue of the apology, I would like to see people being a bit more open to accepting the sincerity of some of these apologies that have come out by these figures.
Me too. I mean, that's where I do think that's where I would like to see us go from here. I don't understand what's wrong with contrition and apology. It's very important to be able to forgive somebody, which it presumes, of course, that the person seeking forgiveness is sincere in his apology. I would like to see people's lives not be completely ruined. I'm absolutely taken aback at the way that without the benefit of any right of defense or any opportunity to explain any mitigating circumstances, people's lives and their livelihood are destroyed. I mean, if I think locally, even for Eric Salvay here, whom I think is a fellow who worked very, very hard for the success he had, there are scores of people who've lost jobs because his production company is finished. He made a personal choice, mind you, in his case, which is to his honor, actually. He made a personal choice to say, I'm closing the doors to my production shop. I'm walking away from public life. I don't deserve your attention until I can come back and deserve your respect. So it was very noble, but it puts a lot of people out of work. And I don't understand why we forgive alcoholics. It can come out that a person was an alcoholic and a terrible alcoholic and might have missed appointments and deadlines and not turned up for work and assaulted people or sexually assaulted people. And yet we forgive the alcoholic when we recognize he's sick and when he accepts to get treatment and go into AA. We acknowledge that we don't reject the entire person. We give the person the opportunity to make amends. And that's why it's so important in the AA movement. You have to go and make amends to all the people you've hurt, right? So I don't understand why that door is not open. I don't know why sex is always fraught with this absolute judgment in a way that other domains of life and other failings of the person do not attract such an absolute negative judgment.
Let's talk about resolution now, and it's fine to have apologies or even make restitution, but how do you change systems that aren't as open to hearing these kinds of complaints from women in the workplace?
Such as? You mean places where men work principally, like in men's locker rooms, sport locker rooms, what else? Engineering firms where women remain underrepresented. The truth is the only way you can affect a change like that cannot come by edict. A change like that has to come from the facts on the ground. A societal change like that requires taking the measures, so to speak, as aggressively as possible, as our new mayoress, Valérie Plante, is trying to do, and create in the different spheres of her governance equal representation of men and women. And until you have in all these male bastions equal representation of women on the ground, you're not going to change those behaviors. A lot of men think they can get away with these behaviors when they're in a homogeneous group, when they're with other men, and they feel they can sort of hide in each other's skirts, if I can mix a metaphor, and they don't have to worry about what a woman's reaction would be. And these bad behaviors can be reinforced. Although, in all fairness, women do the same thing. If you put a gaggle of women together, what's the first thing we're going to do is complain about the guys and say make all kinds of negative generalizations about men that aren't very nice. So an integrated workplace, in the same way that we also try for racially integrated workplaces, why do you think behavior is better in the big cities than in other smaller communities? In big cities, you have more integrated and diverse communities. You have to interact with more people of different cultures and color and religious belief. And of course, men and women interact freely. And as a result, you develop a sensitivity, if only because people will explain to you. Someone will say to you, hey, don't use that expression because it's inappropriate. Should hear Trevor Noah's routine about what it means to use certain racialized epithets and how his perspective is different because he's from South Africa. I will not, of course, repeat it to take away his thunder, and because they're words a white person never dare say, But it's interacting with different people like that so that you learn on your own. I don't even know how it can be taught, actually, to adults, that you learn, that you develop a better sensitivity to how other people feel. Until you have enough interaction on the ground, you're not going to develop a sensitivity about how the other feels.
Well, there's interaction on the ground, and there's also redressing power imbalances.
Forget that. Men will continue to occupy the halls of power. Good luck.
Well, and that's the problem. I think that once you have more representation of whatever group, particularly in a position of power, then that's where you're going to see some of the biggest changes that are going to be taking place. Because once people, if you're saying that a lot of the accusations, a lot of the things in the Me Too campaign that have come forward is, in this case, is men in positions of power that have taken advantage of their positions of power, and women being afraid or discouraged or punished for speaking back or for complaining because their careers are being threatened. And until women have more security in terms of their careers and are in more positions of power, then I think that some of that stuff is still going to continue. And I think so it's not just, the focus shouldn't just be on punishing men or punishing women or people that commit bad acts. It's also on raising the people. It's addressing the situations that make it possible for these things to happen.
In terms of resolution, something that I'm concerned about, because actually at my office at our law firm, I do have a managerial role, and I sometimes have there are incidents between staff members sometimes where I have to make a decision or listen and initiate. And I find what a lot of these stories have in common are these victims, mostly women, not being believed by some of their coworkers or their managers. That then they're, it's funny how with Harvey Weinstein, even and Kevin Spacey and Louis C.K., these rumors were known for a good long time. There were jokes about it on TV shows. And so it suggests that people were told and people just kind of tolerated the environment. So what I think is important is that there has to be a lot more training in HR departments and in among managers across corporate culture. And I also think that, but then what also concerns me as a jurist is that you don't want to have these systems where judgments are made that severely affect people's well-being that don't have the same standards of evidence, same standards of rigor and of assessing credibility, and of that's another thing, a concern I have on university campuses, where you have these sort of ad hoc tribunals that are made that where people are making allegations, they're not signing affidavits, there's no real consequences exactly to lies that they may make in these affidavits. They're speaking to interested parties in sort of informal settings. And so it's complicated. I guess I'm leaving us on a more ambiguous place, but just to say that I think that there has to be a lot more training among the managers and the decision makers who.
Well, I'll try to synthesize that. So what you're saying, and I would agree, as before you look to punishment, you have to have adequate mechanisms of inquiry and judgment if there's going to be a punishment at the other end. If the purpose is improving the ability of coworkers or students or any people who have to live together to socialize and interact positively, then it can be a matter of education and therapy. But education, remember, can have its own pejorative connotation when you start saying, let's send so-and-so for re-education, and we're talking Siberian camps. And it's also something else when you talk about sending somebody through a process of inquiry and hearing and judgment, where judgment can also be a prison term. So I think as a society, we're going to have to decide what we want. And I would like to think that we would err when it's something as amorphous as harassment to education and to improvement of relations in the workplace and in academia, and get away from this punishment and these lifelong punishments with no revision.
And to bring this together, I think that, from my perspective, I don't think there's any straight answers right now. I think that there's an important discussion that's been raised and ought to continue and figure out where we want to draw some of those lines and what direction we want to go to. I think, Mom, in terms of your point where we're addressing education, I think that that's really important to touch on for the next generation, to have discussions about consent, even with little kids. Obviously, not sexual consent at a very young age, but just that if you're playing with somebody, if you touch their body and they don't like it, don't do that. See if people like things before you do it, etc., and that you can say no to things when it concerns your body. And then when it gets to punishment of adults that are committing these behaviors, then I think that something that is important to consider is not to essentialize people. That if we're all going to be judged by the worst action that we've done in our lives, humanity is doomed. If we're just going to all be, and I think that, and it's a personal choice that I make, is that I don't like to think of people as bad or as good. There could be good or bad actions. There could be harmful or unharmful actions. And I think that when we're looking at these men, in this case, these men in positions of power that are committing these actions, then we want to really think hard about, do we want to say that based on this one thing that they did, that they're essentially a bad person and the rest of their life is ruined? Because what I really worry about is then you're going to take a bunch of men who have done, committed these actions, and we're going to completely ostracize them from society and from any opportunities. And what do people that are completely ostracized do? What are we going to do with all these people we've labeled as bad?
Right.
And I think that it's important to think that
They'll continue being horn dogs, and they'll just have to set their sights lower as to whom they can harass.
Well, and it can lead them to be further ostracized and then commit to and then just becomes further social pariahs.
Or you just reject all their life's work. I mean,
Or you reject- yeah.
Hitler built the Autobahn.
Well,
Before we get to further reading, let's leave it there. Thank you for the talk, Goldwaters.
thanks, Dad. And what conversation? What conversation
built
wouldn't
the
be?
Autobahn.
What conversation wouldn't be complete without some reference to Hitler? So thank you, Daniel.
Well,
I appreciate that.
Is it too soon?
All right, Goldwaters, further reading for the subject of Me Too, male aggression, and related topics. Samantha?
I'd recommend this really interesting article by Jessie Hempel on Wired.com. It's called "The Problem with Me Too and Viral Outrage," and I think it's a really interesting article, and I think it touches on something really quite that I think applies to a lot of the sort of Twitter or hashtag movements that have been going on in modern day, and is really worth considering in terms of outrage culture, and does this actually result in any sort of meaningful change? So I thought there were some really great and thoughtful points there, and so I highly recommend it. Jessie Hempel, "The Problem with Me Too and Viral Outrage."
Daniel?
For further reading or viewing, in my case, I don't know why this one really comes to heart, but the film Happiness by Todd Solondz, which is a film from the late 90s, very, very black comedy, and it involves bunch of different stories of people who are in most ways sort of sexually frustrated and pathetic, and at least two of the stories are about male abusers. One is a phone sex addict who kind of creeps on people, prank calling them and masturbating on the phone, and the other one is about a family man who sexually abuses the boy next door. And again, this is a black comedy, but why that comes to mind is that, oddly enough, and I think that was the intention of Solondz in the film, is that it also sort of humanizes these aggressors and presents them as very pathetic and sad and flawed people, but otherwise have a capacity for love and for other people who might care about them and going through their own struggles. So it's sort of a different, but it also, of course, pays attention to the damage that they cause. So even in the context of it being a comedy, there's a certain nuance to it, and it's a very difficult watch, but I recommend it.
I'd like to recommend an article that was recently published in the Paris Review, an article by Claire Dederer, called "What Do We Do with the Art of Monstrous Men?" First, because I'm very taken with her writing. And I wonder if we're related, because she writes it like I think. And notably, she addresses the problem, what do we do when these stars and idols of ours are taken down because we find out about their sordid history of sexual assault and harassment? And one of the focus parts of her article, she speaks about other characters, including, of course, Roman Polanski. What would we do without Roman Polanski as a pillar for the ideology of sexual assault, But that being said, a big focus of our article is Woody Allen and his signature movie Manhattan. And what do you do? Do you reject the art of these monstrous men? Certainly worth reading, and creates quite a reflection and about the ambivalence of how to deal with a fellow human being who has really committed sexual assault, and at the same time may otherwise be a towering figure in terms of the expression of art and culture.
You can find all the further readings at thegoldwaters.ca, along with all the past episodes, and you can join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter with the hashtag #TheGoldwaters. We're looking to hear directly from you as well, the listener. If you want to challenge or if you have any questions for the Goldwaters, drop us an email at talk@thegoldwaters.ca and tell us what you think. I'm moderator Dan Delmar. Until next time.
This has been a production of TNKI Media. Good talk.